Chapter 2. What the trials revealed. It was the three trials that took place in the course of 1949 in Budapest, Sofia and Tirana that proved that the dangerous situation developing in the leadership of the Yugoslav Communist Party was not due to mere political errors, to a mistaken policy, but that it was the result of a deliberate, counter-revolutionary, anti-communist plot carried out by a gang of police informers, agents provocateurs and intelligence agents, centered around the leading Titoites. The indictment of Laszlo Rajk and his fellow conspirators in Hungary was published on the 6th of September 1949. The trial opened at Budapest on the 16th of September. The chief prosecutor of the People's Republic of Bulgaria, Dimitar Georgiev, published the indictment of Traicho Kostov and his fellow conspirators on the 28th of November 1949. Their trial opened on the 7th of December. The trial of the Albanian conspirators headed by Kusik Zoks had already taken place at Tirana in the previous May. What type of men were these conspirators who had plotted the overthrow of the new popular democratic regimes, achieved by so much effort and sacrifice by their peoples, and who had conspired to assassinate such men as Dimitrov, Rákosi and Enver Hoxha? They consisted in the main of former communists who had betrayed their parties under duress and become police informers, and later agents of foreign imperialist intelligence, together with former right-wing officers and state officials who had assumed a left-wing mask towards the end of the Second World War. To these must be added the Yugoslav officials, Tito's envoys, who participated in the various conspiracies. In the Hungarian conspiracy there were 8 accused. Laszlo Rajk himself had been arrested when a young communist student by the Hungarian semi-fascist police in 1931 in Budapest in connection with the distribution of communist leaflets. To save his skin he had agreed to become an informer, an agent provocateur, and had signed a paper to this effect, putting himself at the disposal of the Hungarian secret police. From then his downfall dated. First he was sent to spy on the communist students in Budapest University, then on the illegal Communist Young Workers' League, then amongst the building workers, where in 1935 his provocations led to over 200 arrests. Thence he was transferred first to Czechoslovakia, and from there to the International Brigade in Spain, where he spied on and disrupted the Rákosi battalion. He left Spain for France, where he was confined in various of the southern French concentration camps designed for Spanish Republicans and international brigaders, Saint-Cyprien, Gurs and Vernet. Here he continued his informers and intelligence work in contact with various groups of Hungarian and Yugoslav Trotskyists. Returning to Hungary with the aid of the Gestapo, and working again as a police informer inside the illegal Hungarian Communist Party, he became, after liberation, first the secretary of the Greater Budapest district of the party, then Minister of Home Affairs, and finally Minister of Foreign Affairs. 2 other intelligence agents and police informers involved in the conspiracy were Dr. Tibor Shunyi, who was recruited to the United States intelligence in 1944, sent back to Hungary to penetrate the left and became head of the Kadris department of the Communist Party, and Andras Szalay, enrolled as an informer by the head of the Hungarian political police at Pécs in 1933. Szalay it was who betrayed the leaders of the illegal Young Workers' League in 1942 and who was then responsible for disclosing the planned escapes of Yugoslav and Hungarian political prisoners from Sator al-Jali prison, leading to 64 murdered on the spot or later executed. After liberation, he worked in the propaganda department of the Communist Party. Lieutenant General György Pálffy was one of those opportunist Hungarians who used to be known as insurance agents, who tried, whatever their real political views, to ensure themselves with the regime in power. Son of a bank director and grandson of a kulak, he received a bourgeois education, including a period at the Ludovica Academy where the old fascist coup used to be trained. This political background was further strengthened by a year's service in the Italian fascist army, where Mussolini's Italy became his political ideal. As an officer of Herthy's army, he took part during the Second World War in the occupation of the Carpatho-Ukraine. In 1944, when the defeat of fascism seemed certain, he decided to insure himself for the future, and so he came to an arrangement with his colleague Captain Istvan Lanch, fellow officer in Herthy's army. I agreed with him that he should go to the west with the Herthy army in which he was then actually serving. Then the stream to the west was well underway. He should make contacts there with the British and Americans, depending on who should capture him, or under whose authority he should be. I would stay at home and would attempt to establish the strongest possible left-wing contacts, and would even try somehow to establish contacts with the Communist Party. Our idea was that, however the situation should turn out, we would cover up for one another. Evidence at Reich trial, verbatim report, p. 84. By the spring of 1946, his fascist outlook well concealed beneath the new facade, he had become a general, chief of the military political department and commander-in-chief of the frontier guards, Bela Karondi, a similar personality in a lesser way, starting as the member of the gendarmerie under the Herthy fascist regime, ended in the frontier guards under Lieutenant General Pálffy. Pál Justice, a Hungarian Trotskyist, was recruited as an informer after arrest by the police in 1932. He ended after liberation in the leadership of the Social Democratic Party, and, after unification of the two workers' parties, on the Central Committee of the Hungarian Workers' Party. Finally, the Yugoslav Lazar Brankov, who came to Hungary as a member of the Yugoslav military mission in 1945 and was counselor of the Yugoslav legation at the end of 1947, was the chief representative of the Yugoslav secret police in Hungary from 1947 to September 1948, when, on orders of Rankovic, Yugoslav Minister of the Interior, he pretended to go over to the supporters of the Communist Information Bureau taking refuge on Hungarian soil. The men involved in the Kostov conspiracy were of a similar background and a similar caliber, police informers and agents of foreign intelligence hiding inside the Communist Party, right-wing businessmen hiding their true opinions under a left cloak, and members of the Yugoslav secret police pretending to be opponents of the Tito regime. There was Trejo Kostov himself, who as a member of the Central Committee of the illegal Communist Party was arrested in April 1942, and saved his life by accepting the role of spy inside the party for the Bulgarian police. He became, after liberation, acting president of the Council of Ministers and secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. There were Ivan Stefanov, a member of the Communist Party who was already working for British intelligence in 1932, Nikola Pavlov, who deserted to the police at the same time as Kostov and was sent back by them to work in the party, Nikola Noshev, party member who made contact with British intelligence in 1941 and who became, after liberation, Assistant President of the State Committee for Economic and Financial Problems. Boris Christophe, who accepted the role of police spy when arrested in 1943 and in 1946 became Bulgarian commercial representative in the USSR. Sonut Sonchev, who deserted to the police and betrayed his comrades when arrested with a group of young communists in Varna in 1924 and who contacted American intelligence in 1941. Ivan Gavrinov, landowner and industrialist, who after liberation pretended to be a friend of the People's Government, joined the Communist Party and worked for British intelligence. Blagoy Hatpanzev, who worked as a Tito spy when counselor of the Yugoslav embassy in Sofia and, like Brankov in Hungary, pretended in November 1948 to go over to support of the Information Bureau. Nor is this a full list even of the main conspirators. But one thing they all had in common, all were concealing their real identity under a cloak of falsehood. Whether they were communists who had deserted the cause of communism and saved their skins by becoming police informers and were then made over by their former masters to the Gestapo or French or British or American intelligence or to all of them, or whether they were reactionary gendarmes or officers or businessmen posing as sympathizers of the New People's regimes, or whether they were Yugoslav officials pretending to be friends of the New People's democracies or supporters of the Information Bureau, all of them worked and plotted against their countries, against their peoples and against socialism. One other thing they nearly all had in common. They took their instructions through the intermediary of the Tito clique. The truth about the Titoites emerges. The trials were long trials. The Reich trial opened on the 16th of September and the verdict was given on the 24th of September. The Kostov trial opened on the 7th of December and the verdict was given on the 14th of December. The defendants had every opportunity to speak for as long as and in the way they desired. Many witnesses were called, but one fact stood out in all clarity at both the Reich and the Kostov trial. The guiltiest criminals of all were not present. For if in the dock were Reich and Kostov and the Hungarian and Bulgarian conspirators, who had plotted the overthrow of their people's democratic governments and the brutal murder of the most beloved and outstanding leaders of their peoples, behind Reich and behind Kostov, behind the Hungarian and Bulgarian conspirators, stood the criminal group of Titoite leaders, Tito himself, Rankovic, Kartal, Chilas and some score of others. And behind the Titoites stood the real directors of the plots, British and American intelligence, British and American imperialism. From the trials emerged the real reasons for Tito's false policy condemned in the resolution of the Communist Information Bureau. From the trials it emerged that the Titoite betrayal was of long standing. From the trials emerged the story of how that betrayal had started and how it had ended with Tito and his confederates as the direct instruments for carrying out in Eastern Europe, and indeed throughout the world, the policy of Anglo-American imperialism. Not only Reich and his associates are here in the dock, but their foreign masters, their imperialist masters of Belgrade and Washington. Dr. Gyula Ilapi, People's Prosecutor, Reich Trial, Verbatim Report, p. 753. It was Reich himself who gave the clearest outline of the role of the Titoite conspirators. He contacted them in the French concentration camps set up in southern France for the ex-international brigaders, in the French internment camps, in St. Cyprien, Gurs and Vernet, I was together with the Yugoslavs. There were very strong Trotskyist political activities in the French internment camps. The chief organizers of the political activities, and at the same time their executors, were those inside the Yugoslav group. As far as I remember, there might have been about 150 who were involved in such activities inside the Yugoslav group. The decisive majority of these were intellectuals, petty bourgeois and university students. Reich, evidence at trial, verbatim report, p. 39. The Trotskyites, many of whom had been sent to the International Brigade by the Yugoslav secret police, and who included some of the leading present-day Titoites, were here contacted by the intelligence services of several nations, including the French, American and later German. Reich told of their contact in the camps with the French secret police, the Deuxième Bureau, as a former international brigadier, who carried on Trotskyist activities. I was on several occasions called in and asked for information about what was happening in the camp by the officer of the Deuxième Bureau, the French intelligence service in Gurs and later in Vernet. I have to add that for the French officer to call me in, it was not necessary for him to know my past, because in general, the Trotskyists always, and everywhere, internationally, worked in close contact with the police. I told the French officer, the head of the Deuxième Bureau, that a strong Yugoslav Trotskyist group was active in the camp, and roughly who were the leaders of the group. Then the French Deuxième Bureau officer took out a list which was full of Yugoslav names throughout. He carefully checked the names given by me against this list. I saw that those whom I mentioned as leaders already featured on his list as the leaders of this Yugoslav Trotskyist group. Reich, evidence at trial, verbatim report, pages 3940. He met them visiting the officials of the Deuxième Bureau. From this it became clear to me that these Yugoslavs were, in fact, the organized men of the Deuxième Bureau, and were carrying out its instructions just as I was. Reich, evidence at trial, verbatim report, p. 40. There came the Hitlerite invasion of France. The Yugoslav Trotskyists, who had been passed on by the Yugoslav secret police to French intelligence, were now taken over by the Gestapo. Reich told of a German recruiting commission, headed by a Gestapo Oberwehr major, visiting the camps in the spring of 1941. After the commission had worked for a few days, this major called me to him and suggested to me that I, too, should report for work in Germany, and he would help me to get home to Hungary from Germany. He told me that he was making this proposal because Peter Heine, the head of the political department of the Hungarian police, had asked him to help me to get home to Hungary, as I was an organized agent, who had been working for the Hungarian police for a long time, and he found no other solution for sending me home but this one. During this conversation, the Gestapo Oberwehr major took out a list and asked after certain Yugoslavs. The list from which he read out the names was the same list as the one the leading officer of the Deuxième Bureau had been looking at when I was reporting to him on the activities of the Yugoslav Trotskyist group. He said that he was asking me because if Peter Heine requested him to help me to get home, then he trusted my opinion and considered me a reliable person from his point of view. On the other hand, these Yugoslavs and many other Yugoslavs, roughly those that had featured on that list, that is about 150, had asked him, that is that major, to help them to return home to Yugoslavia. That he really did so, I consider to be proved by two facts. One of the facts is that there were very many Yugoslavs in the group with which I went to Germany. The other fact is that from time to time, biggish Yugoslav groups set out on their way home for Yugoslavia from the neighborhood of Leipzig, where I worked, and their setting out for home in such a legal form, as it happened, could obviously not have taken place except with the support of the German official organs, the Gestapo or other organs. Reich, Evidence at Trial, Verbatim Report, pages 4142. In the course of his evidence, Reich also told how he had been contacted by American intelligence in the French concentration camp of Vernet. It was in the Vernet internment camp that an American citizen called Field, who was as far as I know the head of the American Intelligence Agency for Central and Eastern Europe, visited me in the internment camp after the end of the Civil War. He referred to instructions he had received from Washington, that he should speak with me and help me to get out of the camp and return home to Hungary. He even told me that they would like to send me home because as an agent who had not been exposed I would, working in the party according to the instructions received from the Americans, disorganize and dissolve the party and possibly even get the party leadership into my hands. Reich, Evidence at Trial, Verbatim Report, pages 4647. Thus from the Reich trial it became clear that in the middle and late 1930s a considerable group of Trotskyists and provocateurs remained hidden in the Yugoslav Communist Party, including in very leading positions, when similar Trotskyite groups were being successfully exposed and expelled from other communist parties. These traitors included such men as Kolstanad, Vikmanovic and others of the leading Titoites. A large group of them was dispatched to the International Brigade, and later in the concentration camps of southern France they were in constant contact with the French and German intelligence services, as well as with similar Trotskyites and provocateurs of other countries. Already in the early 1940s the Gestapo and U.S. intelligence were competing as to who would take these traitors over and send them home to carry out the disruption of the communist parties and progressive movements in their homelands. It was finally with the aid of the Gestapo that many of them returned to Yugoslavia. 2. Betrayal of the liberation struggle. The evidence of the Reich, Kostov and Albanian trials showed that these spies and provocateurs, having found their way home with the aid of the Gestapo, linked up with other similar groupings inside the Yugoslav Communist Party, and, as leaders of the partisan and national liberation struggle, continued their work of disruption and betrayal. Some continued to work for the Gestapo, others made contact with British and American intelligence. Some managed to work for all three. But a compact group of leading Yugoslav communists, including Tito himself, Rankovic, Kartal and Gillas, led the betrayal in the course of the war. When the Nazi invasion had rolled over Yugoslavia in May 1941, and when the Yugoslav peoples were being subjected to all the horrors of occupation by the Nazi chiefs and their quislings, it was, to start off with, British policy to support Mihailovic and the Yugoslav Sitniks. Despite the fact that the Sitniks were inactive against the Axis, and despite the fact that more and more evidence was accumulated of actual Sitnik collaboration with the Axis, for many months British aid and parachuted weapons and uniforms continued to be directed to the Sitniks. With British Tommy guns and in British battle-dressed Sitnik units included in the Axis order of battle struck again and again against Yugoslav patriots and partisans. The British wireless was even used to broadcast calls for the assassination of partisan leaders. An accumulation of different factors led eventually to a change of policy. It became more and more clear that the overwhelming mass of Yugoslav people were turning away from the Setniks and regarded them as Axis collaborators. It became apparent that British reaction would gain no post-war foothold in Yugoslavia or the Balkans by basing themselves upon Mihailovic. The Setniks were actively aiding the Axis or else were totally inactive. With the growing difficulties in the North African campaign, the British military leadership in North Africa was calling for the development of guerrilla activities in the Balkans that would lead to the cutting of Axis lines of communications, to the stopping of the flow of reinforcements to Rommel. More and more progressive, genuinely anti-fascist people in Britain and America, even in the army itself, were disturbed at this policy of aiding Axis quislings and demanded a change of policy. At a certain time, and exactly how and when history still has to disclose, the British political and military leadership, on a very high and top-secret level, must have received information, some of which it may have had all along, that there are leading elements inside the partisan forces, inside the Yugoslav Communist Party, spies and provocateurs, Gestapo elements, Trotskyites, who could be trusted from the point of view of British imperialism, and could be used to betray the Yugoslav People's Liberation Movement from inside, and carry out an Anglo-American imperialist policy. This was the basis of the change of British policy from Mihailovic to Tito in the period of 194,243. It was carried out with the maximum secrecy and with that great measure of cunning and deceit for which British imperialism, with its long and unrivaled experience of cunning and deceit, has become notorious throughout the world. On the surface it had to be presented demagogically as support for the patriotic anti-Axis struggle of the Yugoslav partisans. Thus progressive people in Britain and America would be disarmed, they would think that their efforts and struggles were being rewarded. Contact between British and later American intelligence and the Titoite group of traitors had to be kept so secret that only a tiny group of completely trustworthy elements would have knowledge of it from both the Yugoslav and British and American sides. The others, including many in both the British, American and Yugoslav GHQS, would be led to believe that this was honest mutual military aid between allies against the Axis. Thus progressive peoples on all sides could be led into the trap and use all their efforts and energy to further the aid to Tito, which was, in reality, to be used against all that they stood for. The high degree of secrecy led to confusion and dispute between pro-Mihailovic and pro-Tito elements of the U.S. and British ruling classes, including in the Foreign Office and State Department. But this very confusion and dispute gave an air of reality to the plot. Two systems of contact between the Anglo-Americans and partisans were established. A general liaison which dealt with the more open side of military aid and contact, and an inner, parallel, top-secret network, for the use only of the initiated trustworthy few, through which, unbeknown to most of the leading officers and officials on all sides, the real plot could take its shape. Only now, since the revelations of the trials, has the character and organization of this plot begun to be revealed. Lazar Brankov, former counselor at the Yugoslav legation at Budapest, and one of the accused, told of the nature of the plot at the Reich trial, Well, the Anglo-American intelligence thought that first of all there was a well-constructed plan which the British and Americans had worked out with Churchill still during the war. According to this plan, as is usually the case, they did not want to place the Balkans under their influence at the cost of the blood of Anglo-American soldiers, but wanted to achieve this through these experienced intelligence officers, and they wanted in this way to place under their influence the Yugoslav leaders of these days. While the war was still on, they were trying to subjugate Yugoslavia, and then the neighboring states, Bulgaria, Romania and Hungary, to Anglo-American influence, and their primary aim was to restrict the influence of the Soviet Union, to decrease their influence, because they knew very well that the overwhelming part of the great majority of the Yugoslav people stood by the side of the Soviet Union and loved the Soviet people. At that time they planned first to win over Tito, Kartal, Rankovic and Gilas, and through them Yugoslavia. Evidence of Lazar Brankov, verbatim report of Reich trial, p. 117. Brankov spoke of the working out of what he called the Churchill plan. The other case was, and this was more Churchill's plan, that the Anglo-Americans should during the war occupy the coast of the Adriatic Sea. This was no longer necessary, because the coast was already mainly liberated by the partisans and was in their hands. But for Churchill it was necessary then to extend his influence upon Yugoslavia and the neighboring countries. At that time, too, McLean succeeded in gaining Rankovic, Gilas and Kartal for this plan. There was a great argument in the General Staff. Tito agreed with that again, for he thought that Yugoslavia would, at any rate, be liberated by the British. The Soviet command had another opinion on this question and gave Tito advice, so that he retreated, and thus Churchill's plan to invade the Balkans and the Adriatic coast became a failure during the war. Evidence of Lazar Brankov, verbatim report of Reich trial, p. 119. Trecho Kostov, in his written testimony, gave evidence of the same betrayal of the Tito group to Anglo-American imperialism, recounting the substance of what Kartal told him at their interview in Skopje at the end of November 1944. Then Kartal informed me, in strict confidence, that during the war the British and Americans had supplied the Yugoslav partisans with arms and munitions, on condition that at the end of the war Tito would keep Yugoslavia away from the USSR and would not allow the USSR to establish its influence, not only in Yugoslavia, but in the Balkans as well. The Americans and British had taken a firm decision in no case to allow the breakaway of the countries that might be liberated by the Soviet Army from the Western Bloc. On this basis, between Tito on the one hand and the British and Americans on the other, a definite agreement had already been reached during the war. Verbatim report of the Kostov trial, p. 88. It had long been the dream of Western imperialism to build up a confederation of puppet governments in the Balkans and Eastern Europe to act under its aegis as yet one further anti-Soviet base. In the course of the Second World War, Western imperialism became frightened of the character of the popular resistance movements that grew up in these countries in struggle against Axis domination and occupation. They saw in all this struggle and sacrifice of the people, led by the communists, not the struggle of heroic allies against Nazi fascism, but a menace to the future of imperialism in Eastern Europe. In the very midst of the war, the aims of Western imperialism remained unchanged, taking on only new forms. Whilst the Soviet army was meeting and defeating the main forces of Nazi Germany, Churchill's secret memorandum, now made public, of October 1942 stated, "It would be a measureless disaster if Russian barbarism overlaid the culture and independence of the ancient states of Europe." British imperialism, while striving to avoid a real second front, planned to invade the Balkans, and set up in the very course of the war an anti-Soviet grouping of puppet reactionary states. In the midst of the war itself, when Britain was being preserved from invasion by the Red Army, when thousands of patriotic progressives were giving their lives in the resistance struggles of Europe, the Churchill Plan was being drafted for Anglo-American domination in Eastern Europe and for the suppression, not of the Nazi invaders and the Balkan Quislings, but of the resistance forces with the aid of the Balkan Quislings. And in the carrying out of this plan, in the effort to make the Churchill dream come true, the Western imperialists allotted a key role to the Tito clique in Yugoslavia. There was considerable opposition to the policy of Tito, Rankovic and Kartal inside the Yugoslav Communist Party already in the course of the Second World War, and led by such men as Habrang, an outstanding communist leader, and General Arso Jovanovic, Chief of Staff of the Yugoslav Liberation Army. But even those who led the opposition to the Tito clique did not realize that they were dealing with traitors. The Titoites had a way of dealing with opposition, whether inside or outside the Communist Party. Especially Rankovic was important there, because he was organization secretary and he led the cadres department and later the intelligence service, the counterintelligence. The whole party apparatus was in his hands and he succeeded in putting his men everywhere. He succeeded in removing all those who did not agree with the line followed during the war by Tito, Kartal, Chilas and Rankovic, especially their collaboration, and spoke of them to party members as left-wing deviators. And, for example, it also happened, the partisans spoke very much about this already in 1944, that these people, who were considered leftists, and who were the followers of the Soviet Union, and who were not willing to collaborate closely with the Anglo-Americans, were sent during the war to places where it was sure that they would fall. Brankoff's evidence, verbatim report of Reich trial, pages 12,122. Thus in the course of the Second World War the group of Trotskyites and agents inside the Yugoslav Communist Party gained still more commanding positions and, disguising themselves as leading partisans, used their positions to get rid of those who opposed them, by all means including the most ruthless. By the end of the war, they held nearly all the key positions in the Yugoslav Communist Party. The process of getting rid of the genuine internationalists from the party leadership was taken a step further with the arrest of Zujovic and Habrang in April 1948, and by the murder of General Arso Jovanovic. Henceforth the Titoites reigned supreme. It was not by chance that it was British imperialism that played the main role in the course of the Second World War in organizing and coming to agreement with the Trotskyite clique inside the Yugoslav Communist Party. Of all imperialisms, British is the most experienced and cunning. Centuries of experience in victory and defeat have taught it tactics of subtlety and subterfuge, of how to combine seeming concession with ruthless force. So it was British imperialism on the Allied side that first planned and carried out on a big scale the policy of penetration and corruption of the left from inside. The conspirator Ivan Tudiv testified at the Kostov trial that he was instructed by a British agent at the beginning of 1943 to get in touch with progressive circles, especially with members of the Communist Party, with the aim of creating connections in those circles, penetrating into the party and becoming later on a member, with the purpose, one day when it would be very necessary, of assuming a leading position. Ivan Chuti's evidence, verbatim report of the Kostov trial, p. 225. It was the experienced and cunning British imperialism that made the running for the organization of the Tito plot already in the course of the Second World War, and that organized for the post-war period. It was obvious to the British politicians that the war was approaching its end, that the war would inevitably be lost by Hitler, that it would be won by the Soviet Union even before the Second Front was opened, and in such a development of events a predominance of Soviet influence would inevitably be established in the countries of southeastern and eastern Europe. Great Britain could not tolerate and would not endure such a predominance of Soviet influence. That is why she intended to counteract the establishment of Soviet influence in the Balkans, and particularly in Bulgaria, by all possible means. In order to be able to cope with this task, the British intelligence service should be thoroughly well acquainted with what the Soviets and the Communist Party intended to do in connection with the forthcoming development of events. Ivan Chuti's evidence, verbatim report of the Kostov trial, p. 225. But if it was the more cunning and experienced British intelligence and British imperialism that made the running, looking ahead to the post-war world, it was stronger American imperialism that took over at the end of the war. The agents, spies and stooges began very quickly to see which way the wind was blowing and who would be their new master. When I questioned Tito about the orientation of Yugoslavia's foreign policy, he expressed his disdain of the British, who, according to him, were on the wane as a great power and were obliged to cede the right of way to successful American capitalism. Tito gave me to understand that Yugoslav foreign policy was orienting itself towards America, rather than, as before, towards England. He advised us Bulgarians to establish contact with the Americans. Kostov's written testimony recounting interview with Tito in summer 1946, verbatim report of the Kostov trial, pages 99,100. By the end of the war, the Tito clique had become the direct representatives of American imperialism.